when we're looking at tourism to sort of pick up from the what tourism has to be or can't be, um, it's important to remember that one, it's incredibly recent. It basically only showed up in the early 19th century in terms of modern tourism. And again, it's all based largely on the need to find a new base of people that are going to want to spend money, discretionary income. And that's basically the starting to grow in the early 19th century group that's called the middle class. That's so, it's the focus of Marx and Engels' work. And so it's the middle class that basically starts tourism into the industry it is today. And Brighton's the classic example of that, because Brighton's the first, sort of designed tourist destination in many ways. And the key parts are sort of, I went over this when I was talking about, sort of the checklist, but here we actually see a couple of examples of this. Sorry, I was trying to do a switch. Here we see one of the things that made Brighton so successful, and it's sort of interesting because apparently, at least from what I've been able to read about it, this thing was sort of invented, sort of out of nothing. And right from the get-go, or very quickly after it started up, it started to end up with many of the things that ever since then have become like the checklist of tourism. And it's sort of hard to visualize how these guys could have, in the early part of the 19th century, actually really come up with so much of this stuff that ends up being so standard that it's sort of hard to remember. It's not that old. Here we see a part of this, and this is, this fits a lot of those criteria. One, it's different than home. Two, it's exotic. And again, remember this, Brighton's originally always has been, still is almost entirely British tourists. It's not intended for foreign tourists per se, but it fits all those criteria. It's something fun and different than you would do at home. And again, it was easy to get to, still is incredibly easy to get to by train or whatever other transportation. So it was that vicarious other place, the exotic different. And one of the big parts of that would be things like these shops. When we look at these, this is Waikiki or any other place as a tourist destination, you see this. These sort of odd places that have all sorts of odd stuff. You sort of wonder who's going to buy it and what are they going to do with it. But they make money and they sell stuff. And so people are buying this stuff. This is actually central to the idea of the tourist destination is you've got folks with just some discretionary money. They're spending some of that money to get here. A lot of what they're going to want to take home, and classically in Europe, this is either magnets or even still postcards and stuff like that, is they're going to want to take home what are called souvenirs. And, souvenirs have existed for thousands of years. But in tourism, souvenirs become absolutely central. If you think of someplace like Waikiki, probably 70% of what you've got there is in some way, shape, or form a souvenir. And this becomes absolutely central to the tourism industry. And you can see here, one of the huge things of tourism is what you might call the ancillary businesses. All the other type of things that show up that take advantage of the group of people that have, sort of money in their pocket, and they're going to buy stuff that they would normally not buy at home. And so what you do is two things. One is you try to figure out what they don't have at home so you can make it, and some of them tie it to the place. I have no idea what these two animals are doing in front or what this thing is here. But, I can guarantee this stuff here is all small, it's pocketable, it's easy to get to. It's the same stuff, if you go down to Waikiki once it opens, and now it's opened up again, and go into the front door of an ABC store, you see all sorts of little stuff, knickknacks near the counter. That's little stuff for you to pick. I can take back home as gifts for people or something, a remembrance of your trip to Hawaii and Waikiki. That's a large part of this whole sort of tourism logic. And understanding that is absolutely central to understanding what tourism is actually in its most basic level totally about. Tourism has never been intended for wealthy people. Wealthy people go on trips. Everyone else goes on vacations. So your wealthy folks were never part of this. Now, having said that, the guys that run the Brighton business very quickly realized that having members like the British royal family or someone else who's, like the 1840s version of the Kardashians or something show up, then is going to validate why the place is interesting and different. So you're going to drive more people to it. And they were very good at, comping people who, were wealthy or famous to come out and spend a day or two in Brighton. And that would just draw even more people out there to see what they saw. So what you get is several things. One is to emulate the folks that have money. And again, if you think of those folks that were, shopping in that sort of weird knickknack place in Brighton, Those are folks that they aren't upper class. They're not wealthy, urban, sophisticated, members of the royal family or some other elite. They're generally working lower middle class types. They're the types that are going to buy the knickknacks. And that's the group that tourism is intended for. Tourism was always and still is designed for the middle class. The new tourism, like in markets like China that have opened up in the last 10 years, almost entirely it's the middle class that are taking advantage of that tourism. And as that middle class grows, then the number of tourists grows. And so when you look at Brighton right at the beginning, it's the first one that focuses on that very particular, what I'd call market segment, and does an incredibly good job of filling those boxes of what a tourism destination has to do for someone. And in that, there's also a whole set of sort of social factors. And this goes back to this idea of the social part of tourism. Brighton, by no stretch of the imagination, was part of what traditionally in Europe people saw as their, for example, something as simple as the word healthy was not part of what Brighton was. In fact, let's go back here. Okay. If you notice the beach here, the beach is actually rocks, it's pebbles. So this is not a place that you'd want to walk on in bare feet. It could be very painful, I would think. And it's a place that in the 19th century, say prior to tourism starting up, this area was considered unhealthy. In Europe in general, and this is true in North America also, you weren't supposed to expose yourself to the wind. You get sick from it. They were actually called, I think the word is miasma, of unhealthy winds. The water was considered bad. Ocean water in particular, but water in general, taking too many baths was considered bad for you. A large number of the population only took baths, a couple of times a year, if that. So washing yourself, the idea of taking baths and rinsing clothes and stuff, even until the early 20th century, people in much of the world, including Europe and the United States, would brush their clothes off, but they wouldn't wash them. They'd just brush the dirt off the outside. So when you're trying to market this place in the early 19th century, the social attitudes is there's absolutely nothing healthy about a place like Brighton. In fact, it would be considered traditionally in European, especially British society, as being an unhealthy place to go. So the guys that are trying to build up the business in Brighton, one of the first things they have to do is change that. So what they do is that whole very clever, very sophisticated in its own way public relations campaign in the early 19th century, where they have people write articles in newspapers and other media, basically talking about, new medical research, shows, or my research shows, even though most people writing this stuff were entirely fake, they weren't doctors or anything at all, that going to the beach and going outside and exposing yourself to the ocean air and stuff like that was actually good for your health. And what they use as a contrast, in contrast to the urban dirt and grime and pollution that you have in, say, in London, a city like London. So they're not only advertising the fact that Brighton's different, they're advertising the fact that Brighton is healthy. So one of the first things they do is they actually, in a very conscious way, manipulate public opinion and public attitude towards the idea of health and bring Brighton into that. And yeah, you should be healthy, you should go to the beach. And oh, by the way, here's this place we've got called Brighton, fits all those criteria. Boom, off you go. It's in that context that you have to understand tourism. Tourism has always been a social phenomenon. It's based on a particular audience, usually a particular culture, a particular ethnic group. And they define what the tourism experience will be. And it's those set of criteria, which in some cases, based on advertising, can be very easy to manipulate. A good example would be, if you go and you Google YouTube for anything for like spring break, there's a bunch of companies that specialize in spring break tourism. I have no idea what they did this last year, but I can guarantee unless things get really tanked, they're going to be doing huge amount of business in March or April or whatever it is this year, or I should say in 2021. And so what they do is they've, that industry didn't exist in the 1990s. Spring break in the modern context that you guys as undergraduates, or at least sort of your counterparts in the mainland, think of spring break as some sort of destination where you go and you party with, a gazillion other college students and do sort of like, weird crap that you wouldn't do at home, is very much a 21st century model. And so 30 years ago, that didn't exist, spring break tourism in the modern context. The idea of this sort of mass, sort of college urban, experience for the break between classes is a very recent thing. And what you find is that is something that if you're in that business, you constantly hype it. You get on MTV, you have spring break specials, and you do all this stuff, all in a very calculated way to change people's attitudes about what spring break should be. And by the way, spring break should go to X, and I just happen to have these tour packages going to X, and you know, wow, isn't that lucky? So what you do is you change the social attitudes towards something, and you actually aim it at a particular destination or a set of destinations that happens to fulfill that you just happen to be making money at. So social logic is absolutely central to tourism. Tourism is not separate from the social. So it's not like economics or other areas where there's, you know, maybe basic need and kinship, which is sort of intrinsic to humans. This is an entirely very calculated merchandising, private sector, for-profit business, which right from the get-go has been very good at basically taking either existing attitudes, or in most cases amplifying or modifying those, and then setting them up as a way to make money off of people. No, I mean, that's not bad. It's just, it's important to remember that tourism is a very calculated, motivated enterprise. It's not part of what you might call normal human existence or normal ways of doing things, which is one reason why it's so spectacularly designed for the 20th, 21st century. And it's so closely tied to it. And so, you know, what you have to do is, and Brighton again is the perfect first example, is you're actually changing people's mindset or amping up people's mindsets, and then using that as a way to make them happy in terms of giving them an escape, but also making some money off of it at the same time. And notice how there's not any way that these are mutually exclusive. There's no reason they should be. Now, more so in North America, especially the United States, than in Europe, because even today, Europeans do a lot of their, you know, tourism traveling by train or now by air. But in the United States, by 1915, 1920, when private automobiles were becoming largely accessible to a lot of the population, then what you get is a second change, because tourism requires two things. One is it requires a place to go and the desire to be there. So a place to spend your discretionary money. Secondly, is you've got to have the time to do it. And so what you get in the late 19th century is pressure from, you know, groups like the guys that are running these various tourist destinations in Europe and Coney Island in North America, et cetera, is that you start encouraging the private sector, i.e. businesses, and the public sector in terms of government, to actually start giving people days off so they can be tourists. By the time that the car starts getting really into vogue, say around 1920, what you start to get is an increasing amount of pressure on government to start having first extended holidays, you know, having, say, Mondays off or something like that. And then what you get soon after that is a pressure, you know, again through Congress and lobbying by the tourism businesses or the places that want to be tourism businesses to start coming up with the idea of extended breaks, which would be the idea of the vacation. The vacation is a 20th century concept. Didn't exist prior to that. And so, as you can see, the tourism business basically pushes for vacations, because if you've got 5 days off, now you can take that car that you have and now you can go someplace more distant. So in large parts of the United States, especially in the Eastern Seaboard, there was a huge push to make governments require vacations in both initially the public and then private sector. But it was for the purpose of giving people access to places they couldn't get to within just, say, a day or two. So you opened up a lot larger part of the United States to the idea of tourist. And so by the 1920s and 30s, tourism was already starting to be seen as a real growth sector, especially in areas which tended to be fairly poor or rural or weren't involved in other ways of, you know, say, production, manufacturing and such like that. They were just the opposite. So it was seen as a way to sort of spread money around to parts of the United States that weren't part of the, you know, economic activity of the early 20th century. So this, again, then becomes part of this whole idea of the social aspect of tourism, that it's tied to the idea of days off and vacations. And then what do you do on your vacation? Well, you shouldn't stay home with your vacation. You should go somewhere on your vacation. And this becomes, you know, sort of a cyclic thing where the one feeds the other, and you end up with the modern attitude towards days off and vacations. And that becomes really significant, because when jet air travel and the idea of moving people really long distances very quickly shows up in the 60s, then immediately you take people out of their cars, and now what you do is you put them in a jet, boom, off you can go, you know, thousands of miles in 5 or 6 hours. And now large parts of the world have become accessible to the vacationing tourist. And this is the sort of revolutionary technology change of the last part of the 20th century is the access of jet travel. But again, it's for the same audience. We're not talking jet travel with people who can afford a private jet. We're talking jet travel crammed in economy or coach class, to get somewhere. So it's like, it's like the budget trips from here to Vegas to go gamble at, Boyd's casinos in Vegas. Coach economy class, cheap fares, and then, spend your time there. And it's tapping a particular socioeconomic segment of the population. And that's what tourism has always done. It's just gone from a choo-choo train in the 1830s to a private car in the 1920s to, Southwest Airlines, Hawaiian Airlines, and, whatever else in the 21st century. But it's always been based on the same population, the same segment of the population socioeconomically. Now, Hawaii is an interesting situation. In fact, we're one of the classic examples of tourism because in Hawaii's case, as was true of many places, certainly not Brighton, which basically was in existence and had to be made into a tourism destination. In Hawaii's case, what you have, and this is true of some other places, is they already have sort of a mythos attached to them. They have a sort of a sense that, the larger population outside of the place already has built up a set of images and attitudes and values tied to the idea of that location. So by the early 19th century, Hawaii was already seen as part of the Polynesian paradise or Eden. Not very many people had been here, but a lot of people wanted to come here. And in the 19th century, this would be, Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, Isabella Bird, and all these people, when they come here, they write books or stories about their experiences, and that pumps this fascination up even higher. So what you have is this, it's just like taking, like I said in the other class, like having a bottle of Coke, and you sit there and you shake the booger up, and you leave the top on it, and the thing's foaming and it's trying to expand, and it can't. So this pent-up demand was, I don't know that it was intentional per se, but there was already the interest in Hawaii. So what happens if there's the interest and you're involved in some related business, you're going to go and try to make money off of it. And it's important to remember, for example, a San Francisco newspaper hired Clemens to come over to Hawaii and write about the Sandwich Islands. And they did that to sell newspapers in San Francisco. So they weren't interested in promoting tourism to Hawaii. They were trying to sell newspapers, but they did that because there was already interest in Hawaii, in the west part of the United States, that you could tap by writing those stories or having him write those stories. Now, what you then get is this sort of, odd relationship between the stereotypes of the people that want to be tourists and can't yet, and the place itself. And it's important to remember, because this is one of the enormously important aspects of tourism, is tourism is based on the symbols and the symbolism of the consumer, i.e. the tourist. It's not based on the symbols or symbolism of the place that they're going to or the group that they're going to go visit. Just wanted to switch. So what you get here in Hawaii is by the early 19th century, there's already images of this place. By the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, these images have become more solidified. There's constantly new images coming out, but the new images are basically replications of the old images. And these include things like the thatched hut and all the rest of the lays and all the rest of the stuff. By the early 20th century, when moving pictures start up, then these get translated to movies. And I'm not going to bother with those. That's part of the advanced class. But these are the classic images that you can find, like Flame in Paradise or whatever it's called. And there's all these other, Honolulu, probably the most famous one I showed in the other class. One of the most famous ones of these. In this same period, because you have to remember this is when radio is going. So it's movies and radio. TV hasn't showed up yet. This guy here that you see, I think his name is Edwards. Basically, Harry Owens. He basically comes up with the idea that you could use the Hawaii stereotypes and you could actually put those on radio. So rather than picture images, what you could have is audio images. This becomes one of the most famous radio shows of the 20th century, called Hawaii Calls. And this is first on radio. It's one of the most popular radio shows in the world at the time, in the 40s and 50s, I think. And then when TV shows up, it becomes one of the first TV shows. Now, the fascinating thing about this is you have to remember TV, when it was done back in the day, was actually on film, basically. So they're recording it, and then they would have to take the films and then fly them back to the mainland to then broadcast them, on mainland TV stations. So it's an incredibly expensive, complicated process. But the radio show is already so popular that when moving pictures come up, and the idea of personal moving pictures, a TV set, this is like a no-brainer to make this happen. Now, we're going to watch a little bit, so I'm going to hop through a little bit of this, but what I want you to think about when you're watching this is remember that the stereotypes that you see in this TV show are actually a reflection of stereotypes that by the time this was done in 1958 had been around for over 100 years. So they go back to at least the 1840s, 1850s. This is just the 1958 interpretation of that set of stereotypic images of the idea of Hawaii. And you can see this just in this frozen spot between him with the lei, the weird, I have no idea what, I don't know what to call that shirt. And then here you've got the classic backdrop, which is a hut. And of course, in this context, it's obviously supposed to be a Hawaiian hut. Now, notice that this also means one of the important parts of tourism here in Hawaii was not just the place, i.e. the Hawaiian Islands, but it was the folks that were called ethnically Hawaiian, in the sense that the population of the islands that was the original inhabitants are a key part of what makes Hawaii unique. And that is right from the get-go is a large part of the tourism experience. In fact, tourism in the 19th and early 20th century in Hawaii consisted of two things. One, seeing Hawaiians, and two, going to check the volcano out, i.e. Kilauea.
And maybe you'll give us all a little lesson in how to make this wonderful basic commodity of the islands called poi. And we will make some for every girl and boy. Pounding, 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 wonderful. Pounding, 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 boy. And we will make some for every girl and boy. Pounding, 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 boy. I'm not gonna hold me. I know both work today. Down there at Eagle Lake. And I got Mama, don't hold me. I bring a lake for you. I sing all day for you. The song of Hawaii.
So notice what you're seeing here is here you've got the beach backdrop. So you've got the trees, and this was, I believe, largely filmed at Kapiolani Park. I think that's where they used to film. I think it's where they later had the Kodak Hulu show or something like that. But notice the main thing you're actually marketing is the people that are being stereotyped as Hawaiians. So in large part, this is what people wanted to see. Now in the radio show, of course, this is what they just heard. When this turns into TV, now they actually get to see what they were before they were just hearing. And so this was the already existing stereotype. This isn't like these people invented this. This is just the 1950s interpretation of the Hawaiian. Now, again, remember, this is the stereotypic mainland interpretation of this. No one's interested in who these people actually are. No one's interested in what their background is. Ironically, a fair number of fairly famous kumuhulas from the late 20th century got their start on this radio show because it paid good. A lot of the entertainers in the backdrop, actually, a couple of them actually became famous politicians here later. So was hugely significant. But what you weren't going to see is someone dancing kahiko. You weren't going to see someone doing a traditional chant. What you were going to see is the mainland's view of Hawaii and the mainland's view of Hawaiians. Now, in that context, no one's interested in what the actual genealogy of these women are. What they are interested in is the fact they're dressed in moves. They've got poi, which no one at the time, on the mainland knew what that was. They've got leis at the yin yang, and they've got, hats and the whole thing. So this is the stereotype of the Hawaiian. Now, notice one of the other stereotypes from a behavioral standpoint is that the ladies can goof around. They're supposed to be at work, but they're not at work. They're supposed to be at the cannery, but they're not there. They're just going to sit here, sing and dance and party and have a good old time and then make some poi to eat. So among the other stereotypes is the idea that you're going to have Hawaiians don't have to be worried about going to work. They're very carefree and, da-da-da-da-da. And that becomes part of the stereotypes that are actually packaged as the experience. Now, when tourism picks up, so if we suddenly kick this forward 6 years, and it's now the jet travel period, and United Airlines has started to fly people in here in bulk, and you start to get bulk tourism coming on Roberts buses from the airport down to Waikiki to stay at the Hilton and the other hotels. This then translates to the hula shows at the various hotels, and what you then get is an expansion of the idea of the Hawaiian. Now, the concept of who the Hawaiian is never changes. It's still the ladies that can dance, the guys can all play guitar, ukulele, everyone eats poi, and everyone just sort of goofs around and has a good old time, and they're all friendly as hell, and they'll just ooze aloha. And that's the stereotype that the mainland expects. So when people start showing up here en masse in the mid-late 60s, they expect to see these people. Now, as far as they're concerned, they're not only the people they're going to see when they get to Waikiki, these are the people they're going to meet at the airport, and this is everyone else they're going to come in contact with here in the islands, in the Hawaiian Islands, is going to be people like them. Because as far as they're concerned on the mainland, the only people that live here in Hawaii are Hawaiians. And that, by that they mean this population. Now, notice they're not interested in the physical appearance. This could be someone, that's pretty haole looking, but with a good tan and black hair is going to be Hawaiian. And if this sounds really goofy, think of the Hawaii Five-0 series. I'm not sure if that's still on, but one of the lead characters is actually a haole guy from Australia who's supposed to be Hawaiian or part Hawaiian. So what you get is this very strange idea, which has no basis in reality, but it doesn't make any difference because the tourist is paying for it, just like they paid for stuff at Brighton. And so tourism here, unlike the Brighton's thing, which is entirely based on physical appearance or physical place, here in Hawaii, if you notice, what's actually front and central in here is not the place. The place is the background. What's front and central is the people. And so in Hawaii, what you market for your tourism, the stereotypes that get marketed in Hawaii are Hawaiians. Not Hawaiians in the sense of who Hawaiians actually are, but Hawaiians for the tourism business. And that's still true in 2020. And this is not unique to Hawaii. This is true of many places where what you actually end up marketing is the people or the perception of those people, the stereotype of those people becomes what's actually significant, not the place. No care tomorrow. That's the stereotype of Hawaii. Now, for a tourist from, say, the mainland or some other place, that's incredibly attractive because where they have to live to work, and when they get a couple of days off, they come to Hawaii, and it's a fantasy. So the idea that you can actually be at a place where no one has to work, that people can just dance all the time, and they all know how to dance, and they can all do hula, and is a fantasy, and that becomes what they expect to see. And since they have heard it for 100 years, or I should say they've seen it for 100 years, they've heard it since the early 20th century, and especially after Hawaii Calls, they hear it, I think, once a week. 1935. So, for 20, 30 years, they've heard the sounds of Hawaii, which is, I think, how they actually packaged that show. And that's, of course, that's not Hawaiian music. It's haole music, largely written in LA in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So that becomes Hawaii, and that becomes the expectation of what Hawaii should be. And so when you get mass tourism showing up, it's that type of tourism. And this is things like the Kodak Hula show. There was the Don Ho show back in the day. All the big hotels had ballrooms or whatever you want to call them. And they would have hula shows or other types of shows and events. And the function of those was to provide these stereotypes for the tourists to be happy because they could actually experience what they had always dreamed of, which is what before they'd either only heard on the radio or saw on TV. And they did a good enough job that Hawaii was incredibly popular as a tourist destination. Now, the thing that crops up in this, I think I mentioned the last time that sort of ends up jamming this up, is by the 70s, 80s, and especially the 80s and 90s, is the word authenticity starts to pop up. And if you think about those ladies in that 1958 TV spot, there's not a lot that's authentic about that, in any way, shape, or form. Now, you have to remember, we're not talking authentic in terms of who those ladies actually were. What we're talking about is authentic in the sense of what tourists feel is the authentic Hawaiian experience. So in the desire to get that, they start to leave Waikiki, and they don't go back to Waikiki, because as far as they're concerned, Waikiki is basically a Hawaiian version of Brighton. It's not very authentic. It's sort of fun in little doses, but they want to start getting a better sense of what actually makes Hawaii unique. In other words, they want to find the true Hawaiian. Now, mind you, that true Hawaiian, like I'm doing that in quotes, is exactly the stereotype version. But they think there's something more real than the 1950s, 60s one. That becomes the resorts. Mauna Kea, Kapalua, Turtle Bay to a lesser extent, Waikoloa. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Where basically you actually take people out of the urban area of Honolulu, put them in areas where the landscaping and such gives them a feel for the Hawaii that they've seen in the movie sets and such like that. Because remember, that's what they're looking at. They're not looking at the real Hawaiian Islands. They're looking at movie sets. But that's the Hawaii they expect. Which means, among other things, those of you that are interested, is when you walk through a lobby or you walk through these resorts, you're going to find a lot of plants that are actually from South America, birds of paradise and all sorts of gingers and stuff like that, none of which existed in Hawaii. Many of which were actually imported after they showed up in movies. Because by that time, by the 1960s, 70s and on, the tourists that are coming over here expect to see the vegetation that they've seen in the movies, but they want to experience them for real. So if you're a hotel lobby, you have to have birds of paradise and all this other nonsense, because guess what? That's what's in the shows, and that's what must be real. And that's why if you go to a lot of the hotels, you'll still see parrots around. Why? Because they had them in the shows. They don't have parrots here in Hawaii. We do now. You know, and you see a lot of them in the hotels. Why? Because that's part of the stereotype of this place generated by the media in the past. So the enclaves end up being little bubbles. They're like a Disneyland, in the way that Disneyland replicates stuff. The enclave resorts replicate the movie set Hawaii built out larger, and you can actually walk through it. I'll think it that way. And so that becomes the Hawaiian experience in the late 20th, early 21st century. Now, it then happens is several things. More and more of this same group of people, now more upscale, decide that they really, in some cases, like particular locations. They're going to start investing in them. They're not just going to go there for a couple of days. They think, oh, I want to come here again and again. I really like this place. And so what they do is they start to actually buy things. Initially, these are timeshares, which we don't have time to get in this class. Don't worry about them. But what they then start to do is start to become the idea of actually purchasing a place in paradise, i.e. Hawaii, and becoming part-time residents. And this is, of course, a huge industry here. This starts in the early 1990s in Maui. It's part of my dissertation research. And then later moves to the other islands. That's now a huge part of the experience here. And that becomes important, because then what happens is now your tourist is not someone who comes for a couple of days and goes back home. The tourist is now much more sophisticated. They are much more aggressive in terms of what they want. They're totally bounded up with this idea that they want authenticity. So if, like you as Chaminade students, what they really want to do is they want to experience the Hawaii that you experience. Now, not the Hawaii you actually experience, but the Hawaii that their stereotypes of Hawaii think you experience. So they still think you can all surf. They still think you guys can all play ukulele. They still think you can all dance hula. They still think you can all do that stuff. Doesn't matter whether you can. And that's what they want to experience. They don't want to experience your actual lives. They want to experience your fantasy lives that fit their stereotypes. But they think the real authenticity is going to be if they can live next to you. Now, initially, this is the part-time residents in places like Upper Kula. By the early 21st, well, actually, by about 10, 15 years ago, this becomes the Airbnb industry. And this is why it's so popular globally, because the attitude of tourists changes and authenticity becomes more and more central to a happy tourist experience. So if you're going to go to Portugal, you don't want to go and stay in a hotel in Lisbon. You want to live in a house in Lisbon around a bunch of local Portuguese and experience Lisbon the way the locals do. And that's how you sell tourism in the 21st century. You don't sell tourism the way you did 40 or 60 years ago. It's not Hawaii calls anymore. And it's not Hawaii calls any place in the world. Now, this has huge social impacts, because tourism, when tourism was someplace else, was fairly easy to deal with. You know, if you're on Maui, for example, and tourism used to be the Kaanapali resorts, you know, a little bit of maybe Lahaina and then the Wailea Makena resorts, and that was pretty much it. So, you know, if you don't want to deal with tourists, you just stay away from those places and you make sure you don't work at the resorts. And you don't have to deal with the tourists. They might go driving by, but you and they are in different worlds. They're going to be at the resort. They're going to play golf there, go to the beach there, buy stuff in the stores there at Whalers Village in Kaanapali. So your two worlds are going to coexist, but they're not really going to be pimping into each other. Now, when those tourists first own houses in Maui, but even more importantly, they start renting Airbnbs from the guy next to you. Now, all of a sudden, they're with you. And the thing is, they're following you around because they want to experience what they think your world is. So they're going to want to go eat at the plate lunch place you guys go to. They're going to go shopping at the food land in Pukalani because that's where you go. But they're not interested in the boring stuff that you do. They want to see when you do what they think Hawaiians are supposed to do. And I'm not talking about whether you're ethnically Hawaiian or not, it's just their view of Hawaiians, which includes everyone that lives here. The one thing they don't want is they don't want to be around tourists. That's what they really hate. So what's happened in the 21st century, in the last 5 years especially, is hotel tourism is collapsing. Dispersed residential tourism is just going up at the same residence rate. So as we've gone from 10 million tourists to 12 million tourists in the last couple of years, or I should say 9 million tourists to 11 million tourists in the last couple of years, hotel occupancy hasn't gone up. those tourists are all disappearing to Airbnb. So they're ending up in places like Lanikai, for example, or Kahala, living in people's houses for a couple of days or a week. They're not in hotels, which means that now if you're a part of the local population, you have to deal with tourists, next door or down the street or whatever. You don't have the ability to basically segregate whether you want to be involved in the tourism business or not. In the modern world in 2020, once COVID starts to shut down a little bit, everyone's in the tourism business all the time, whether they want to be or not. And this is a huge change because the stereotypes that drive tourists haven't changed. Their stereotypes of the folks here haven't changed. If they go to someplace like Creta in Europe, if they go to Spain, they expect all the Spanish to dance flamenco and do, chase bulls or whatever. And that's what they want. And their attitude is, well, I'm paying a lot of money for this Airbnb and to rent this car, and so I should get what I want. So the consumer aspect of a purchase is the same. But what they think they're buying has changed radically. And that makes tourism a much more conflicted industry in the 21st century because tourists are much more aggressive about finding places. So, you don't go eat at the hotel buffet, you go to Rainbow Drive-In. And in doing so, that allows you to experience, if you're a tourist, that allows you to experience what you consider the real Hawaii to be like. And you're only going to go there if you see a lot of locals at Rainbow Drive-In. If you go someplace and you see tourists, you won't go there. Now you guys can see this if you actually go on Yelp. If you look at restaurant ratings on Yelp, one of the things that frequently pops up is, locals eat there. And for the tourist group, that means a bunch of tourists are going to show up. This classic example, this would be Leonard's Bakery down there in Kapahulu. That's popular with the tourists because it's popular with locals. This is the new tourism of the 21st century. This is having enormous social impacts as populations are realizing that what they're selling is basically the stereotype of themselves. And here in Hawaii, it becomes very complicated because the stereotype we sell is not the stereotype of local. The stereotype we sell is of a particular ethnic belief group, which is the Hawaiians. And yet the Hawaiians get less out of tourism than anyone else. So the group that you market is not the group that benefits from the tourism. And that's not unusual. It's typical in many parts of the world. That makes tourism a very complex industry in many ways in terms of the impact that it has on populations and the impact it has on cultures. It's not by accident that fascination with dance and song has become so popular in Hawaii. Competitive hula shows are like Merry Monarch, are popular. They're hugely popular. But a lot of that's actually driven by tourists who want to experience what they see as traditional Hawaiian events. So you find other stuff like, for example, stuff that you do like fishing. It's not going to be popular to tourists, even though that's very much a Hawaiian thing to do, because tourists don't see that as being unique or interesting or exotic or different. So what happens is parts of a culture that are tourist interesting get amplified. Parts of a culture that either are too personal or aren't tourist interesting get sort of pushed down, and in some cases start to disappear. And that makes tourism a very, very stressful event for many populations in many cultures in many places, is the impacts of tourism. It's real interesting if you go to Japan, for example, you talk to folks in Kyoto, which is the traditional culture center of Japan. They've absolutely had it with tourists. They really want to start limiting the number of tourists and get rid of 50% of them. Because as far as they're concerned, you can't be Japanese and be part of traditional Japan or modern traditional Japan and be surrounded by tourists all the time, because that's what the tourists want. They want to follow you around all the time if you're Japanese. They don't want to go to tourist places. So this is the puzzle of tourism in the 21st century. It's almost based in many places, it's based almost entirely on ethnicity, but it's not the ethnicity in terms of what people identify themselves as. It's the stereotype that the consumer has of that ethnicity or that place. And that's what they're paying for, is they're paying for their stereotypes to be fulfilled. They're not paying to be educated in the realities of a group.